I stood outside the modest apartment on 15th Street, the crisp morning air heavy with the unspoken tension of what lay ahead. Sadie Boehm, the woman who had called in the welfare check, stood a few feet away. Her trembling hands clutched her phone as she tried to explain her unease. She hadn't heard from her boyfriend, Rogelio Gutierrez, in over 24 hours. That wasn't like him, she said. He was a man who always kept in touch, especially with his children. Rogelio Gutierrez was well loved. His life centered around his 2 kids and his construction work. His family described him as dependable and caring, someone who never let a moment pass without making his presence known in their lives. His girlfriend's concern wasn't misplaced, and as I stepped into the apartment, I quickly understood why. The living room was a battlefield. Blood spattered the walls, ceiling, and even the furniture. It was clear this wasn't just an injury or an accident. Something violent and calculated had happened here. The signs of struggle told their own story. Furniture was pushed askew, a coffee table overturned. On the floor, a distinct void in the bloodstains suggested that a rug had been removed. It was a chilling sight. Every instinct told me this was no mere disappearance. Rogelio's car was still parked outside, his wallet untouched, his phone going straight to voicemail. Nothing about this suggested a man who had walked away from his life willingly. Sadie's face was pale, her voice wavering as she tried to recall their last conversation. She spoke of how much he loved his children, how he was supposed to pick them up for a family outing. His absence screamed that something was terribly wrong. As we began canvassing the scene, the name Zachariah Anderson surfaced, first whispered by Sadie and later confirmed by Rogelio's family. Anderson was Sadie's ex, the father of her children. Their relationship had ended bitterly, marked by his controlling tendencies and relentless need to keep her within his grasp. Sadie described the way he would appear, unannounced, following her, questioning her every move. She'd tried to move on, building a life with Rogelio, but Anderson wouldn't let her. In the days leading up to Rogelio's disappearance, Sadie had noticed things that now seemed sinister. The way her car registration had gone missing, her realization that her daughter had been used as an unwitting pawn in Anderson's surveillance. Sadie's voice broke as she recounted the growing tension, the creeping fear that Anderson was always watching. And now, with Rogelio gone, her suspicions boiled over into dread. Neighbors confirmed hearing muffled sounds late at night, but no one had seen anything unusual. Still, the blood in the apartment told us more than words ever could. It was evidence of violence, of desperation. Someone had tried to erase Rogelio's presence, to make him disappear completely. The missing rug, the open patio door, it all painted a picture of premeditation. Rogelio's family arrived soon after. His mother's grief was palpable as she clung to his photograph, her voice a trembling prayer for answers. His children were too young to understand, but the weight of their questions hung in the air. Where was their father? Why hadn't he come home? As investigators, we often encounter these moments of raw human emotion, but even as we comforted the family and assured them we would find the truth, the enormity of the task ahead loomed large. Whoever had done this had not only taken a life, but shattered the fragile web of love and trust that surrounded it. I watched as the forensic team meticulously cataloged the evidence. Every bloodstain, every fiber, every trace of the life that had been violently disrupted. The scene whispered of a struggle, a final act of defiance from a man who fought for his life. Yet as the hours turned into days, Rogelio remained missing. The only clues left behind were the chilling remnants of that night and the growing shadow of suspicion that pointed squarely at Zachariah Anderson. We didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a case that would unravel more than one life and expose the dark undercurrents of obsession, jealousy, and a desperate need for control. For now, we had a blood-soaked apartment, a missing man, and a family waiting for answers. And as I stepped out into the bright sunlight, the gravity of what lay ahead was unshakable. This wouldn't end until we found him. or what was left of him. The morning after the initial investigation, I found myself back at the station, reviewing every detail we had uncovered. There were still too many questions, too many gaps. The crime scene was rich with evidence of violence, but devoid of the one thing we needed most: Rosilio Gutierrez himself. The name Zachariah Anderson was scrawled across my notes, underlined multiple times. Every lead seemed to circle back to him. Sadie Boehm sat in an interview room, visibly shaken. She clutched a tissue in her hands, twisting it as she spoke. Her voice cracked under the weight of her memories. "Zach couldn't let go," she said. "Even after we broke up, he always found ways to insert himself into my life." She detailed the years of control and manipulation, the endless arguments, and the way he hovered over her even after their relationship ended. "I tried to keep things civil," she continued, "for the kids, but he didn't see it that way. He thought I was his, even when I wasn't." She hesitated before mentioning something that sent a chill through the room. Anderson had a habit of following her, sometimes with their children in tow. He used our daughter, Olivia, to spy on me, to keep tabs on what I was doing. I leaned in, sensing the gravity of her words. "What do you mean by that, Sadie?" She took a shaky breath. "He would ask her to watch me, to tell him who I was with, where I was going. Once, he even made her cover her mouth so her breath wouldn't fog up a window while they watched me through it." The depth of his obsession became clearer with each word. Sadie described an incident where Anderson had stolen Roselio's vehicle registration from his truck, telling their daughter he might use it for fun. It wasn't a harmless prank. It was a calculated move by a man consumed by jealousy and resentment. Sadie's fear was palpable, but it was her daughter Olivia who provided the most chilling insight. When we brought Olivia in for questioning, her youthful demeanor was overshadowed by the gravity of what she had endured. She recounted how her father had driven her to Sadie's house late one night. They parked outside, watching through the windows. She remembered the unsettling quiet as her father directed her to cover her face, a cloak of invisibility in their act of surveillance. "Norman told me to stay quiet," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted to know who Mom was with. It wasn't just spying. It was the foundation of something darker." Olivia's account painted a picture of a man who refused to let go, whose need for control extended beyond boundaries most would consider sacred. Anderson's behavior was no longer just concerning, it was escalating. Sadie's relationship with Roselio had ignited a fire in him, and the flames were spreading. As the investigation deepened, we uncovered more unsettling details. Anderson had been seen near Roselio's apartment on several occasions, sometimes parked in his van, other times lurking on foot. He made no attempts to hide his disdain for Roselio, often referring to him with derision in conversations with mutual acquaintances. It was clear he viewed Roselio not as a person, but as an obstacle, a barrier to reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. Sadie's fear grew with every revelation. "I knew he hated Roselio," she admitted. "But I didn't think he'd do this." Her voice faltered as she gestured toward the photos of the bloodied apartment. "I didn't think he was capable of it." The more we learned, the clearer it became that Anderson's obsession had metastasized into something malignant. He wasn't just watching from the shadows. He was planning, calculating. His erratic behavior wasn't the result of momentary lapses, but the culmination of years of unchecked control and jealousy. The rug missing from Roselio's apartment, the bloodstains that told a story of violence, it all seemed to lead back to Anderson. The tipping point came when we executed a search warrant at Anderson's home. His property revealed more than we anticipated. A large burn pit in the backyard, still smoldering despite days of heavy rain, immediately drew our attention. Nearby, a bleach bottle and remnants of burned fabric confirmed our worst suspicions. Inside the house, we found cash, electronics, and a chillingly empty sense of normalcy, as if he had been preparing for something catastrophic. The most damning evidence, however, was in his van. The unmistakable smell of bleach filled the air as we opened the doors. Sections of the carpet were missing. the padding beneath soaked with a residue that glowed under luminol. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A tiny speck of blood that would later tie Roselio's DNA to Anderson's vehicle. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but they were far from complete. As I stood outside Anderson's property that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was more than just a murder. It was a story of obsession, of a man who couldn't bear to lose control, and of the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. And yet, one question remained unanswered. Where was Roselio? His absence hung over the investigation like a storm cloud, dark and foreboding. We had evidence of violence, of meticulous planning, but until we found him, or what was left of him, justice would remain elusive. The hunt was far from over. The morning air was thick with tension as we prepared to search Anderson's family tree farm, a sprawling property dense with potential hiding places. We knew this was a crucial step. Every piece of evidence we had collected pointed toward Anderson as the prime suspect, but without a body, the case remained precarious. The farm, with its acres of woods, ponds, and secluded corners, loomed as both a challenge and an opportunity. By dawn, the search teams were ready. Ground-penetrating radar, drones, cadaver dogs, and dozens of officers from multiple agencies had assembled. The sheer scale of the operation was daunting, but the weight of finding Roselio, or any trace of him, was heavier. The cadaver dogs were the first to explore. They moved methodically, noses low to the ground, weaving through rows of trees and overgrown trails. At one point, all 3 dogs signaled near a large burn pit. The area had been disturbed recently, with ashes and charred remains still visible despite days of heavy rain. The smell was acrid, a mix of burned wood and something less identifiable, but distinctly foul. As we sifted through the pit, pieces of scorched fabric began to emerge. Some were too damaged to identify, but a few retained enough structure to suggest they had once been clothing. Among the debris, we found a partially melted bleach bottle. The label was still intact, its purpose clear: to destroy evidence. Fire and bleach, a deadly combination designed to erase the past. The burn pit wasn't the only focus. The farm's expansive grounds included a pond, dark and murky, its still surface hiding untold secrets. Divers entered the water cautiously, their movements slow and deliberate as they searched for any sign of a body or discarded evidence. The sonar scans were promising, picking up shapes that warranted closer inspection. Each time the divers resurfaced, we held our breath, hoping for answers. Each time they shook their heads. The pond yielded nothing definitive. Inside Anderson's minivan, the discoveries were equally grim. The smell of bleach was overpowering, a chemical assault that made even the most seasoned investigators recoil. A large portion of the van's carpet had been removed, and what remained bore stains that glowed faintly under luminol. It was here, in the smallest of details, that the case began to pivot. A tiny speck of blood, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, was discovered on the rear quarter panel. The lab results would later confirm what we suspected. It was Roselio's blood. The significance of that single speck was monumental. It placed Roselio inside Anderson's vehicle, a connection Anderson had vehemently denied during questioning. He had claimed to never have met Roselio, let alone had him in his van. The blood told a different story, one of violence and transport, of a man's life extinguished and his body moved to an unknown fate. Back at the station, we reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby Walmart. On the morning of May 18th, Anderson was seen entering the store. He purchased garbage bags, latex gloves, and bleach, all with cash. The timestamp on the receipt aligned perfectly with the timeline we were constructing. His intent was clear. He was cleaning up a crime. As damning as this evidence was, the absence of a body continued to haunt us. Without Roselio, the defense would undoubtedly argue that he had simply disappeared, that he had walked away from his life. It was a weak theory, contradicted by his devotion to his children and his complete lack of contact since the night he vanished. Still, the prosecution needed more to cement the case. We turned to Anderson's digital footprint. His laptop revealed a disturbing obsession with Roselio. Folders filled with screenshots of Roselio's social media accounts, business information, and photos painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy. Anderson's search history included terms related to surveillance and stalking, further cementing his role as a predator. Despite these breakthroughs, the investigation wasn't without its frustrations. We combed through every piece of property Anderson had access to, from storage units to remote lots, but Roselio remained elusive. Each dead end felt like a personal failure, a reminder of the family waiting for answers, and without him, justice would remain incomplete, a hollow victory for a family left in limbo. We pressed on, driven by the hope that somewhere, in the vast expanse of evidence and intuition, lay the key to unlocking the truth. The trial of Zachariah Anderson was destined to be anything but ordinary. With no body, no murder weapon, and a defense eager to exploit every gap in the prosecution's case, the courtroom became a battlefield of narratives. On one side was a story of cold, calculated violence, and on the other, a desperate claim of circumstantial assumptions and missing links. The prosecution opened with a vivid reconstruction of the crime. They painted a picture of Anderson as a man driven by jealousy and control, unable to accept that his ex-partner, Sadie Boehm, had moved on. Roselio Gutierrez, they argued, had become a target not for who he was, but for what he represented: freedom from Anderson's grasp. Through forensic evidence, the prosecution built their case brick by brick. The blood found in Anderson's van, though just a single speck, carried immense weight. DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to Roselio. The burn pit, still smoldering after days of heavy rain, hinted at a frantic attempt to destroy evidence. The bleach-stained interior of the van, the missing carpet, and the Walmart purchases of gloves, bleach, and garbage bags painted a chilling picture of methodical disposal. Anderson's digital footprint was equally damning. Investigators unearthed files on his laptop detailing Roselio's life, photos of him with his children, screenshots of his social media, even business documents. It was a digital shrine to his obsession, one that revealed an alarming level of surveillance and premeditation. Coupled with testimony from Roselio's friends and Sadie about Anderson's stalking behavior, the prosecution argued this was a man who had crossed the line from jealousy to violence. But the defense was unrelenting. They seized on the lack of a body, emphasizing the difficulty of proving a murder without one. Their strategy was to cast doubt on the forensic evidence, suggesting that the single speck of blood could have been transferred inadvertently. They dismissed the burn pit and bleach as circumstantial, arguing that no one had witnessed Anderson committing the crime. In their opening statements, they leaned heavily on the idea of reasonable doubt. "There's no body," the defense attorney repeated, pacing before the jury. "No murder weapon, no witnesses. What the prosecution is asking you to believe is based on assumptions, not facts." They also pointed to the complexities of Sadie and Roselio's relationship, suggesting that other, unknown forces could have been at play. It was a calculated move, designed to muddy the waters and shift focus away from Anderson's behavior. Then came the testimony of Olivia, Anderson's teenage daughter. The prosecution called her to the stand, knowing her testimony could be a turning point. As she recounted how her father had involved her in his surveillance of Sadie and Roselio, the courtroom was silent. She described being told to hold her breath to avoid fogging up the window while spying, and recounted how Anderson had used her as a pawn in his twisted scheme. Her voice broke as she spoke of her fear, her confusion, and her realization of the role she had played. The moment was raw and powerful, a stark reminder of the collateral damage of Anderson's obsession. But the defense was quick to counter, questioning her memories and suggesting she had been influenced by her mother and the prosecution. Anderson's behavior during Olivia's testimony did him no favors. At one point, he appeared to gesture subtly, as if signaling her to stay silent. It didn't go unnoticed by the jury or by the judge, who issued a stern warning. The moment became a flashpoint, highlighting Anderson's attempts to manipulate even from the defendant's chair. At one point, he issued a stern warning to the two defendants present, about the judgment to be issued on another matter. The trial reached a crescendo with the introduction of a jailhouse informant. A cellmate of Anderson's testified that Anderson had boasted about making a body disappear, earning the nickname Houdini among inmates. The informant described Anderson's chilling words, claiming he had stabbed Roselio and disposed of the body. While the defense dismissed the testimony as unreliable, it added another layer of menace to the prosecution's case. Throughout the proceedings, the absence of Roselio's body hung like a shadow over the courtroom. It was both a challenge and a testament to the prosecution's resolve. They didn't shy away from the difficulty of their task, instead framing it as a reflection of Anderson's calculated efforts to evade justice. In their closing arguments, the prosecution appealed to the jury's sense of logic and humanity. Roselio may be gone, but he hasn't been silenced, they said. His blood, the evidence, and the actions of the accused tell us everything we need to know. Zachariah Anderson committed this crime, and it's time to hold him accountable. The defense countered with an emotional plea, warning the jury against convicting a man based on what they called speculation. They pointed to the gaps in the evidence, the unanswered questions, and urged the jury to consider whether they could truly be certain of Anderson's guilt. As the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The stakes couldn't have been higher. For Roselio's family, desperate for justice. For Sadie and her children, seeking closure. And for Anderson, whose future hinged on the jury's decision. The trial had laid bare the dark depths of obsession and control, but the final verdict remained uncertain. The courtroom was still as the jury returned. All eyes were on the foreperson as they delivered the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Zachariah Anderson, guilty. Sadie Bowman's breath hitched as relief and sorrow washed over her. Olivia sat motionless, her gaze fixed forward. Across the room, Roselio Gutierrez's family wept softly, their grief mingled with a sense of justice finally served. Anderson showed no visible reaction, though his defense team exchanged hurried whispers. The guilty verdict extended to all charges, including stalking and concealing a corpse. The decision was resounding and left no doubt of Anderson's guilt. During sentencing, Roselio's father spoke through tears about the loss of his son and the pain of not being able to lay him to rest. "We have no grave to visit, no place to mourn," he said. Olivia, facing her father in court, delivered a statement that resonated with the room. "I've wondered if you ever truly loved me. Today, I choose to move forward, but without you." Anderson maintained his innocence in his final remarks, but the judge was unmoved. Life imprisonment without parole was the sentence. "You destroyed a life and tried to erase all traces of it," the judge declared. "This court sees through your actions." For Roselio's family, the verdict brought justice but not full closure. His body remained missing, a cruel reminder of their loss. Sadie and her children began to rebuild their lives, finally free from Anderson's shadow. Though justice was served, the case sparked broader discussions about stalking, domestic violence, and the challenges of prosecuting without a body. It was a painful reminder of the devastating effects of obsession and control. While Roselio's voice had been silenced, the verdict ensured his story would not be forgotten, a tribute to those who fought tirelessly for the truth.